Welcome to OTV. This is season 2, episode 13. My name is Otoma Edje. We have the incredible honor today of having Mr. Douglas Massey with us. If you can maybe just do a little bit of a wave there so we know who you are. Okay. And Douglas Massey has written this incredible book, American Apartheid. He co-authored this book with Nancy Denton. The subtitle of the book is Segregation and the Making of the Underclass. And in today's interview, we will review how the Black underclass were created and consider solutions for the future. That's really what we want to go after today. To assist with the interview, we also have Greg Moots. If you can do a wave, I guess we all know there's only one person left there. Greg will be assisting with this interview. He is the lead planner in the Office of Zoning, Innovation, Planning and Development Department in the city of Detroit. Well, we have a lot of questions today, so let's go ahead and dive right in. The first question I have for you, Mr. Doug, is, although there are many factors, such as banking, education, there's many things people can point to that cause segregation and create like an underclass. I think what you've noted is that housing is the main one. Can you please elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, housing is the essential element for any kind of social stability in society. If you don't have stable housing for yourself, it's going to be impossible to get a good education, to hold a job, to raise a family. It just makes everything else completely impossible to manage unless you have stable housing. And the thing about housing is when you rent a house or buy a house, you don't simply purchase a dwelling. Let me turn off my email. You don't simply purchase a dwelling, but you purchase a neighborhood, or you rent a neighborhood as well. And in recent years, it's become increasingly obvious through a lot of studies done by both sociologists, geographers, as well as economists, that neighborhood conditions matter a lot in determining your life chances. And if you live in a poor and disadvantaged neighborhood that's also racially isolated, you have a big barrier to progress in American life. And if you live in a more integrated or white neighborhood with a lot of advantages, then you have a leg up in life. And so housing really is at the core of the processes that produce poverty in the United States and not only make poverty occur, but transmit it across generations and over their lifetime. And one of my colleagues at Princeton, Pat Sharkey, wrote a book called Stuck in Place, where he showed us what's happening now is that poor African Americans are basically stuck in low income, very disadvantaged neighborhoods. And that's become the factor that perpetuates their disadvantage over time.
So one of the things I wanted to talk about today is looking at how, I'll just say the ghettos, I think this is a word that has been used in literature, so I'll use that term, didn't just come about, but they were created. And so I think if you can maybe address how things were before 1900, specifically the point is that things were not as segregated as they later became. So can you maybe talk about how things were before 1900 a little bit?
Well, prior to 1900, 90% of all African Americans lived in the South and overwhelmingly in the rural South. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, there was segregation then, but it was segregation by region, and segregation by state, and segregation by county. Most white Americans didn't live in the South and didn't live in rural counties in the South. And so whites were separated from blacks at a very macro geographic level. What changed in the 20th century was the Great Black Migration northward. And in cities in the North prior to the Great Migration, levels of black-white segregation were low or moderate. There weren't very many black citizens in places like Chicago and Cleveland and Detroit. They lived in poor neighborhoods, but they lived in poor neighborhoods with other poor whites and other poor immigrant groups, and they weren't that segregated. But when African Americans started arriving from the South in large numbers and the Black populations began to increase very rapidly, levels of segregation between Blacks and whites quickly rose. And initially, the mechanisms that were used to enforce a residential color line in American cities, the initial mechanism was violence. When Blacks began to move into neighborhoods where they weren't wanted, they were often targeted for sporadic violence or even systematic violence by organized groups. Early on in the 20th century, local leaders attempted to solve the violence problem by basically passing Group Areas Act, like the Apartheid state of South Africa, setting aside neighborhoods for Black residents and white residents in cities throughout the North. I think the first such ordinance was in Baltimore, and it was spreading rapidly through cities in the border areas and in the North.
That was 1910, right?
That was, it was around 1910. And they were spreading rapidly until 1917, when the Supreme Court said that those were unconstitutional. Okay. And so after 1917, that mechanism for segregation failed. And during the First World War and the war boom, Black migration accelerated. And the Black ghettos got increasingly crowded as spaces were divided and subdivided to make room for the new arrivals to work in the war industries, especially after the US entered the war. And density levels in the ghetto rose to huge, astounding rates. And of course, eventually they spilled over into white neighborhoods. And from 1917 to 1920, this spawned a wave of race riots throughout the United States, where whites rioted against African Americans who were moving into their neighborhoods and engaged in communal violence against African Americans. Any African American who was outside, who dared to cross the color line and was in a neighborhood where it was considered to be white, were not welcome and were met with systematic violence. The biggest race riot occurred in Chicago in 1919 and resulted in widespread death and a lot of property destruction. And here, with the property destruction is not good for the real estate industry. So the real estate industry steps in and they create a series of mechanisms to promote segregation as part of their basic business practices. The first mechanism was code restrictions, deed restrictions, where they would write deeds, and in the deed they would say this property cannot be rented or sold to an African American, or at times it was Jews as well,
or Irish,
and Irish, but that can only occur on a house by house basis, and so it wasn't very efficient. So they moved from there to what are called restrictive covenants, where a restrictive covenant is a contract that is proposed for a residential area, say a neighborhood. And when a majority of homeowners or property owners in the neighborhood agree to the contract, sign the contract, which states that we, these assigned people, agree not to rent or sell our houses to Black Americans, then it became a binding contract, and people who violated it could be taken to court and sued. And that became the mechanism to enforce segregation. And that was the principal mechanism up until the 1930s. Mm-hmm. And then in the 1930s, of course, the Depression hit, and the federal government got involved in housing and other markets in big ways under the New Deal. And when the FHA was formed, the Federal Housing Administration, and began to issue mortgages and to begin to participate directly in housing markets, they basically adopted the private practices and institutionalized them into federal policy and federal law. And they even expanded on federal policy and federal law. So the FHA initially required that houses insured under the FHA mortgage program were covered by restrictive covenants, basically giving the federal government's seal of approval and power to the enforcement of a color line in American cities. And they even went, the private sector one better, because they also required the neighborhoods receive approval for lending. And to this end, they created something called residential security maps, which color-coded neighborhoods all over the country as red, yellow, or green. and red neighborhoods were prohibited from receiving FHA loans.
That
And
was that the HOLC that started that?
it was the first, the Homeowners Loan Corporation was formed in early on in the 1933, and then it was folded into the FHA in 1934 and became part of the FHA. And it was the originator of the residential security maps, but then they became basic tools for the FHA, and that instituted the practice of redlining, basically drawing red lines on maps to color code neighborhoods, and invariably any black neighborhood was color coded red. And so basically it was a way of disenfranchising entire neighborhoods, blocking them from receiving any kind of federally backed loan. And of course, this only reinforced private practices and really made the federal government part of the enforcement apparatus for maintaining and creating this segregation in the post-war period. It didn't have a lot of effect in the 30s and 40s because of the Depression and then the war. There was very little housing construction, but it really had an effect in the post-war period. Mm-hmm. FHA also discriminated against urban housing. FHA loans were not eligible to be served on attached housings like row houses, dense multi-unit housing, any building with a commercial establishment in it. So entire areas of central cities were ineligible for FHA loans. And this basically channeled all of the lending out into the suburbs where they could conform to the FHA standards, which would be a single family house on a large lot. And that's basically, and it was so subsidized by the FHA that it made it cheaper at that point to buy a house in the suburbs than to rent in the city. And there was a massive exodus from central cities. And African Americans finally were able to move into housing in central cities because there was this mass exodus of whites. But the white exodus was into suburbs, which were themselves highly segregated and maintained their own private policies and reinforced by federal FHA policies to produce white ghettos in the suburbs. And the central city areas, the poorer central city areas where blacks were moving into, became part of an expanding black ghetto. And this was the period when cities like Chicago and Baltimore, Washington, Newark rapidly changed from white to black. Chicago became about 40% black, Baltimore became majority black, Washington became majority black, Newark became majority black, Gary became majority black. Mm-hmm. And of course, once the central city is all black, it is by definition cut off from capital and lending. So once a neighborhood turns and becomes black, it's redlined. It's full of black people who are ineligible for federal lending and private lending. And if you cut off the supply of capital into a neighborhood over a long period of time, the only outcome that's possible is decline, a material decline in the quality of housing and the maintenance of public goods in those neighborhoods.
As you're going, I appreciate everything you're sharing. I think one of the things that you mentioned in your book was there were 39 fire stations that were shut down in one area, I believe you'd mentioned.
Yeah, that came later. That was in the 1960s and 70s. But it grew out of the systematic construction of the ghetto and the way it was created and cut off from any kind of investment. Mm-hmm. And the thing about segregation is that it works to the disadvantage of any segregated group. Mm-hmm. For a variety of reasons. First, it makes discrimination and exploitation easy and efficient, because if you want to exploit people or to exclude a people, you just exclude the area. Right. It becomes easy to do. And that's what happened. And it also, we know now that when you concentrate a group of people with a high rate of poverty, you also concentrate poverty and create a very more unstable and disadvantaged residential environment. And the concentration of poverty, spatial concentration of disadvantage, has emerged in recent years as the single biggest factor in promoting the perpetuation of poverty across time and across the generations.
A lot of the public housing seemed to contribute to that, unfortunately.
Public housing was brought in to protect white areas from the expansion of the ghetto. And it was really a pairing of urban renewal policies with public housing policies. So urban renewal was, in theory, designed to upgrade neighborhoods, but in practice, it was basically used by local elite interests in real estate and banking and civic leaders to use the eminent domain power granted under the urban renewal programs to gain access to land that was in danger of being invaded, as they saw it, by African Americans. They gained access to it, and then they would turn it over to institutional or business uses and block the expansion of the ghetto in that direction. And you saw this in Chicago, and you saw this in New York, and you saw it in Philadelphia, you saw it in a variety of places. The place that's best studied is Chicago, but it occurred all over the country. And the urban renewal legislation had what's called a 1-for-1 rule. So if you tear down a unit of housing, you had to have some place for the people to go.
Right.
And so that's where public housing came in. So in Chicago, and especially on the South Side, you had University of Chicago and Hyde Park, and Illinois Institute of Technology, and Robert Reese Reese Hospital, Michael Reese Hospital, banding together with city leaders to create these urban renewal authorities to gain control of the land and insulate themselves from the expansion of the Black Ghetto on the South Side. They tear down entire neighborhoods in the old Black Belt, and then you'd need another place to build projects to house those people. And so you can't build those in white places, so you tear down another neighborhood that's full of Black people, and now you house 2 neighborhoods worth of Black people into a high-rise ghetto. And because it's public housing for families, by definition, all the families are poor. So you drive up the concentration of poverty to neighborhoods where you have a huge density of poor people living on top of one another with poverty rates of 80, 90%, which did not exist in the private market.
Right.
And so that was a big factor in concentrating poverty. And one last feature of exploitation and exclusion that's made possible by segregation is that segregation makes it easy to elect Black representatives, but it leaves them politically isolated.
Correct.
And it makes it easy for white people elsewhere just to simply forget about problems in the ghetto because it doesn't affect them and they don't have a material interest in what happens, at least a direct material interest that they realize. And so between these 3 things, concentration of poverty, the political isolation, and the inability to move to access and gain access to advantaged neighborhoods and to move where the opportunities are, it really worked to perpetuate poverty. And this all came home to roost in the 1960s and 1970s. And this is when in the Bronx, New York, they needed to cut during New York's economic crisis. They needed to make cuts. Where you make the cuts? You make the cuts in the Black and Latino neighborhoods because they're isolated, and the other neighborhoods don't care. And that's why the Bronx was burning in the 1970s, because they cut out most of the fire departments there. And of course, the Bronx had been redlined, and so the housing was deteriorating, and it was susceptible to fires. So part of the informal process of urban renewal, so to speak, in the Bronx in the 1970s was basically burning out everybody. And that was well documented by studies in the 1980s. So that's kind of the story of how the ghetto was created. It wasn't something that happened just spontaneously. It was first institutionalized in the private sector by the real estate and banking industries, and then it was given federal authority under the FHA lending programs. And these things didn't even start to become undone until the late 1970s. So discrimination in the sale and rental of housing wasn't prohibited until 1968 with the Fair Housing Act. Discrimination in mortgage lending wasn't prohibited until 1974 with the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. And redlining was not prohibited until 1977 with the Community Reinvestment Act. So it's not until 1977 that federal laws finally ban discrimination and completely ban discrimination in home lending and in real estate marketing. So and then of course the discrimination doesn't disappear, but because it's prohibited, it goes underground. It becomes much more difficult to observe and still occurred. So segregation levels rose in the early 20th century, were really high by around 1950. And despite the massive geographic expansion of the ghetto and the dramatic increase in the Black populations outside the South and in urban areas all over the country, despite the massive demographic change, segregation levels did not change very much. They stayed at very high levels. And they only began to come down slowly at first after the Civil Rights era. And in 1980, there was very little hint of declines in segregation. Over the succeeding decades, we see some hints and some declines in segregation of Blacks from whites in the United States, but the declines are very uneven across the country. Some places have declined quite a bit. Other places have remained very segregated. Indeed, the term we use is hyper-segregated. Detroit, of course, is one of the hyper-segregated metropolitan areas, along with Chicago, Cleveland, Philadelphia, New York, Newark, Milwaukee, St. Louis. These are large Black ghettos anchoring a long-standing pattern of segregation that has not changed even up through 2010, when we have the most recent census data to look at the patterns.
Thank you for that. Are you aware of any other cities that actually use a physical wall to separate racial areas? In Detroit, there's a wall about a half-mile long that hits 8 Mile Road in the Wyoming area that was, used as a physical barrier between two neighborhoods. An extreme example of physical redlining, if you will. Are you aware of other cities that went to that extreme to separate one neighborhood or group from another?
I think even the history, if you're aware of the history of that particular wall, if you can maybe share about that.
I mean, it was built in, it was built in the late 50s, I believe. It was built again to separate, it was really built on redlining. 8 Mile was extremely poor. It was considered blighted, so there was an opportunity to build a white neighborhood adjacent to it. And at that time, it was determined that, to your point of redlining, it was determined that if a wall was put between the existing African-American neighborhood and the new proposed white one, that then the white neighborhood would not be subject to the redlining and loans could be issued to it. So it goes, again, to your point of financing really drove the creation of that wall, because it was, hey, if there's a wall, then it's safe to lend money on the other side of the wall, which is, again, a whole nother part of that whole story, obviously. But
it became a physical representation of a symbolic line that was already there.
Yeah.
I don't know of any other place like Detroit where they actually built a wall, but they did build physical barriers through infrastructure investments. And one of the most common one in American cities was highway construction. The 50s and 60s were the construction of the interstate highway system. And where you place an interstate highway creates a physical barrier, of course. And if you look at Chicago, for example, the Dan Ryan Expressway on the south side of Chicago goes right along the borderline between the old Black Belt on the south side to the east, and then to the west was Bridgeport, the home neighborhood of the Daley family and the Irish Americans and other Eastern European ethnics in Chicago. The Dan Ryan was basically cited so as to create a physical barrier separating the Black south side from the white working class southwest side, and just to the east in the old Black Belt. That's where they built the largest concentration of public housing in the United States, with 20 blocks of high-rise, high-density public housing running from about 35th Street and to about 55th Street on the south side, about 4 blocks wide, 20 blocks long. And that became emblematic of the high-rise ghetto in the 1960s and 70s.
Indeed. In your book, you use the term hyper-segregation, and you talked a little bit about it, but can you really share both what it is and why it's so detrimental to the Black ghetto?
Well, when Nancy and I were doing our initial work back in the early 1980s and late 1980s, there was a big debate in the field about how to measure segregation, and all these different measures proliferated. And so we decided to take a look and see how they all related to one another. And we used a technique called factor analysis, which allowed us to find common axes of variation that underlie the different indices. And basically we found that all the indices lined up on one of 5 dimensions. So unevenness, the degree to which blacks and whites are unevenly distributed in space. Isolation, the degree to which blacks live in all black neighborhoods. Clustering, the degree to which neighborhoods that blacks occupy cluster together in space. Centralization, the degree to which those neighborhoods are in towards the center of a metropolitan area in the older urban core. And finally, concentration, just the sheer density of settlement within black areas. And we found that when we measured these 5 dimensions, that there was a subset of American cities where African Americans achieved high indices on at least 4 of the 5 dimensions simultaneously. In some places, all 5 dimensions. And we called this hyper-segregation because it's segregation across multiple geographic dimensions. And so places that were hyper-segregated were like Chicago and Detroit. And these are the cities where poverty was more entrenched, where the underclass metaphors were most in evidence, and were really the focus of the whole debate about the causes and consequences of urban poverty in the 1980s and early 1990s. A debate which was strong at the time, but then disappeared during the late boom and later in the 1990s, and kind of disappeared from the American scene, at least in public debates. But the reason that we wrote American Apartheid in the early 1990s is because Nancy and I were doing all this work, showing that segregation was at high levels, showing that segregation just didn't happen, but was constructed, and it was constructed explicitly to exclude and exploit African Americans. And somehow in the underclass debate, nobody mentioned this fact. So on one side were conservatives like Charles Murray, who said, well, it's the welfare system that tracks people in poverty, blah, blah, blah. And on the other side, it was people like William Julius Wilson, my friend Bill Wilson, who was saying it was the transformation of the urban economy and the elimination of high-paying manufacturing unionized jobs. And there was an element of truth to that. There was no truth to the welfare story. But neither side was mentioning the fact that this was occurring to a group that was highly segregated in space. And that when the economic transformation happened and jobs disappeared and poverty rates rose, the increase in poverty was spatially concentrated in black neighborhoods. And this brought about the downward spiral. So segregation had to be part of the story that was told to explain what was going on in creating the so-called underclass of the 1980s, which was a shock to people at the time because this would be the first time that poverty rates got stuck and were no longer falling, and in fact increased. So that's the genesis of American Apartheid as a book, to bring segregation into the policy discussions as a problematic element, and not just accepted as well. It's just the way things are in America. It's a fundamental cleavage in America that was created for racially restricted purposes to disadvantage one group of people in particular. And since the 1980s, a lot of things have changed, of course. Class segregation has risen as well. And the Latino population has grown rapidly, going from about 4.7% of the population in 1970 to around 18% today. And surpassing African Americans as the largest minority, if you can call Latinos as a group a single minority. In the early 1970s, Latino segregation outside the Northeast was not very high. But since then, with the huge increase in the population, with the racialization of Latinos in public media and in public discussion, with anti-immigrant sentiment on the rise, and with the rise of a large undocumented population, levels of spatial isolation for Latinos have gone up. And I excluded the Northeast before when I said levels of Hispanic segregation were not so good, not so high. In the Northeast, things were always different because the Northeast is the only area where Mexicans and Central Americans are not the majority. In fact, there's no majority within the Latino population, but it's heavily Caribbean in origin, from Puerto Rico, from Dominican Republic, from Cuba. And those populations are Afro-Caribbean populations. And if you look at the data in New York and Boston and places in the Northeast, that levels of segregation for Latinos break down along the lines of race. So Black Latinos, Black Hispanics are about as segregated as African Americans. White Latinos, white Hispanics are more like European ethnic groups like Italians were in the 1950s and 60s. And people that are mixed race or identify as mixed race are in between, but more towards the high end of the scale. So, I mean, the Latino populations in the Northeast show the importance of race and skin color stratification in housing markets. And that pattern has persisted to the present day. And the thing that's changed is that Mexicans and Central Americans have gotten more segregated as they've been more demonized in the public media. And as the population has, the proportion of the population that's unauthorized, undocumented, and really lacks civil rights in the United States has grown to create a different kind of segregation in American cities.
Thank you for that answer.
All right, so I'm gonna go, I had a question here. So I know as recent as the 1980s, we have documentation of what the average white person believes about Blacks. And I'm guessing this probably is now also similar for Latinos, I'm guessing. This is from the Detroit area survey from 1980, the Michigan State Democratic Party from 1985, the San Francisco, and I guess the Lou Harris Newsday poll. There's a whole bunch of them from 1988. Can you please share about some of those stereotypes? And I think, to me, it kind of pains my heart, because I think this is also what prevents us as a society from coming together to really address these issues. So can you please share about some of those stereotypes that you saw in your research?
Yeah, the civil rights era did change attitudes in important ways. So if you look at polls from the early 1960s, before the '64 Civil Rights Act was passed, for example, or just about the same time, large majorities of white Americans believed in segregation as a matter of principle. They believed that Blacks should live in separate places. They believed that they should sit in the back of the bus. They believed that schools had to be segregated. So they were really principled racists. That changed in the course of the civil rights era. And by the late 1980s, only small minorities of whites believed in segregation as a matter of principle. It never went away, of course, but a minority went down to low levels, partly because attitudes really did change, and partly because of what survey researchers call social desirability bias. You wouldn't want to admit you're a racist to people anymore because that was a bad thing. Of course, Trump has reversed that, but that's another story entirely. So you have this bifurcated configuration of white attitudes where they don't believe in segregation in principle anymore. And in principle, they think everybody should live wherever they can afford to, and they think that people should have equal rights in housing markets and be treated equally. But at the same time, in practice, they harbor a lot of negative stereotypes about African Americans, about proclivity towards crime, laziness, welfare dependence, substance abuse, all kinds of things. And they're not very comfortable being around very many African Americans. And so you've got this new configuration of white attitudes where they don't believe in segregation in principle, but they don't really want to live around African Americans in practice. And what happens under these circumstances? Well, if you live in a metropolitan area where there aren't very many African Americans, you can desegregate and you still don't have to live near many African Americans. So, Tucson, Arizona is about 3% Black. You completely desegregate Tucson, and on average, every neighborhood is 3% Black. Well, that doesn't bother white people that much. But that can't happen in Chicago or Detroit or Milwaukee or Cleveland or New York. You can't desegregate and not live near Black people. And so basically you see this bifurcation of segregation trends with rapid integration in certain metropolitan areas that have small Black populations that are relatively more affluent and less disadvantaged, in places with large military bases and large number of colleges and universities, and without restrictive density zoning in the suburbs, those places have desegregated quite rapidly. But in places where you have a large disadvantaged Black population that is concentrated in high levels of poverty, we don't have any movement towards desegregation. So hyper-segregation in the hyper-segregated areas, the large ones has remained. So Chicago has not changed, Cleveland has not changed, Milwaukee has not changed, New York's not changed, Newark's not changed, St. Louis has not changed. They're all still hyper-segregated areas. But you found rapid desegregation and massive Black metropolises in Tucson, Arizona, San Jose, California, Seattle, Washington, Salt Lake City, Utah. So it's only a large number of places, but only a small number of Black people live in them, and that experience desegregation, and the large mass of urban African Americans still exist under conditions of high segregation, and about a third of all African Americans in cities live under conditions of hyper-segregation still.
Yeah, that's scary. I know you mentioned a little bit about the political climate, not to get too political necessarily, but do you feel like attitudes have changed, or you think they're getting worse or staying the same as far as how whites view Blacks, generally speaking, in the United States?
Again, I think we've got a division of attitudes. So work with the General Social Survey, which goes back to the early 1970s and continues to this day, about attitudes and beliefs. You see that people who are Democrats have become more and more accepting of African Americans and less racist and more anti-racist. And independents have also moved in that direction, though not as strongly. Republicans, however, have not changed. In fact, Republicans have focused on racial animosity, racial resentment as increasingly the organizing principle for being a Republican. And this was encouraged beginning with Richard Nixon, whose Southern strategy involved placating racists in the South and racists in the North. And he agreed to formally pretend to support civil rights while doing everything he could to slow down civil rights enforcement, and thereby bring the Republicans the Southerners into the Republican Party and out of the Democratic Party. So Strom Thurmond eventually switches from Democrat to Republican. And then they doubled down on this over time with George H.W. Bush. The first George Bush used to be a liberal Republican from a liberal part of Texas, from Houston area. And he ends up with the Willie Horton commercial to really play on racial fears and racial resentments in a very direct way in his campaign against Michael Dukakis in Massachusetts. And then, so this came to be called dog whistle politics, where you would use coded language and what you're really talking about is Black people in cities that we don't like. But Trump comes along and he throws away the dog whistle and he just becomes explicit about it. And over the course of his administration in the last 3 years, he's become ever more explicit and ever more forceful in his expression of white grievances. And so you've got white grievances driving one political party in a very important and very central way, whereas independents and especially Democrats have moved in precisely the opposite direction. And so we've got this split in American public opinion, and this election is going to be a hinge election, I think, in important ways. Really, the issues boiling down is do we want to be a white racist, white superiority society, or do we want to be a more inclusive, welcoming society that abandons racism as an organizing principle? I think it's finally come down to that after all these years. And finally, we're facing up to the reality of the Confederacy and the South and the Civil War. After Reconstruction was abandoned in 1876, the North basically just let the South go back to their own system of racial oppression under Jim Crow. and let them get away with the convenient fiction that, oh, well, it wasn't really a war about slavery. It was about this lofty principle of states' rights. And when Woodrow Wilson was elected president of the United States, that was the first effort to take the racism of the South and make it a national policy. He resegregated the federal government when he became.
He was from Virginia, right?
He was from Virginia and North Carolina. I think his father was a Presbyterian minister, and one of his earliest memories was his father's opening up his church to wounded Confederate soldiers. And so he was an out-and-out racist, and did his most to disadvantage African Americans when he became president of the United States. In the wake of the Civil War, even after Reconstruction ended, Republicans had protected Black jobs in the federal bureaucracy, and didn't allow a segregated bureaucracy to occur in Washington, D.C., which is way below the Mason-Dixon line. When he came into office as the first Democrat elected since Reconstruction, he got elected with Southern votes, and so he paid the favors back by imposing segregation, cashiering Black professional level people from jobs in the federal government, and basically striking a huge blow against the economic foundations of Washington, D.C.'s Black community, which used to be one of the nation's elite Black community. And that was really the beginning of the downturn of the Black community in the Washington, D.C. area. It was really steps backwards in terms of racial egalitarianism. And that was only the first effort to take the principled racism of the South and make it a national policy. During the New Deal, the Southern delegation, which was part of the Democratic coalition of Franklin Roosevelt, made sure that any piece of New Deal legislation was thoroughly racialized to exclude African Americans. And this is very clearly documented in a book by Ira Katz-Nelson, who's a political science professor and historian at Columbia University. The book's called When Affirmative Action Was White. It's about
I've heard of that.
It's about the exclusion, a systematic exclusion of Blacks and Mexicans from all the New Deal programs. And so Wilson was really the first person to come out of the South into the North and do that. And Franklin Roosevelt was from the North, but he was beholden to Southerners who controlled all the committees in Congress, and he couldn't get any piece of New Deal legislation through unless he racialized it. And so the New Deal was racialized. That's why the FHA wouldn't rent or sell to Black people, and that's why segregated unions could exist. That's why Black people couldn't get access to the GI Bill.
A lot of stuff. So just in closing on my part, and then Greg has a few questions. Detroit at one time had one of the highest home ownership rates for African Americans, over 50%. This was as recently as 2000. What do you think led to that, given that financial tools were stacked against African Americans?
Well, first of all, Detroit was a one industry town and really very much a working class town. It had large center of the automobile manufacturing industry in the United States. And it was a town not of apartment buildings, but of homes. And so there was a lot of opportunity for home ownership. And the auto industry, despite Henry Ford's predilections, the auto industry was kinder to African American workers than other industries. The Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO, worked hard to organize African Americans into unions and give them the same access to unions, not segregated units with separate contracts, but standard contracts that everybody got. And so the Auto Workers Union, United Auto Workers, was open to African American membership more than the trade unions in the AFL, the American Federation of Labor. And so Black Americans had a strong economic base with employment in the auto manufacturing industry in highly paid unionized jobs that were stable and reliable. They had access to a large pool of homes for sale, and they had an economic platform and a supply of housing and a demand for housing that they could satisfy. And so homeownership rates were much higher in Detroit than other cities around the country. That was basically interrupted by the industrial transformation of Detroit away from auto manufacturing and the progressive collapse of the auto industry in Detroit. And over time, redlining and the lack of investment in the communities, private investment in the communities and public investment in the communities brought about their deterioration. And that was the story with Detroit.
Thank you.
And one final thing happened, and we've talked about redlining, and that was the mechanism by which African Americans were deprived of wealth for most of the post-war period and into the almost to the turn of the 20th century. After, in the 1990s and increasingly in the year 2000, a new form of wealth extraction emerged, and that was reverse redlining through predatory lending. So prior to the late 1980s, early 90s, you wouldn't lend to blacks because they were untrustworthy, and you knew that they were going to be turned down for capital, and they couldn't get loans. The neighborhoods are bound to go downhill. Afterwards, suddenly, when a new invention came along called mortgage-backed securities. Mortgage-backed securities, you don't go to a bank and get a mortgage and then pay back the mortgage over time to the bank, and you know who the banker is and you can go renegotiate. No, mortgage brokers go out and peddle mortgages to private homeowners and private home buyers, and then they sell these mortgages to financial institutions on Wall Street who package them to back up financial instruments. So when you pay back your loan, you're not paying into a bank, you're paying into a collection of loans that back a security that somebody's purchased, and that's paying the interest and principal off that security. And in this context, black homeownership became a very tempting target for predatory lending, because under a banking mortgage system, the number of mortgages that can be made is limited by the deposits on hand. But in a mortgage-backed security system, the number of mortgages that can be made is limited only by the capacity of bond markets for mortgage-backed securities. As long as there are investors willing to buy these things, you can generate zillions more crappy mortgages. In fact, crappy mortgages became necessary because you wanted to create a balanced portfolio. So you wanted some high risk and some low risk, so you could convince yourself that you're equalizing the risks and balancing things out. And so companies like Wells Fargo targeted African Americans for high risk, high cost loans, and took advantage of the fact that they were a pool of homeowners that somehow had overcome all the barriers to become homeowners in the post-war period, and actually were sitting on homes that they owned outright with equity, and that became a tempting target. So they would go in with home equity loans, and where the average white home mortgage holder would be a home buyer, the average black would be a home owner taking out equity from the house, and they were and the mortgage brokers took advantage of the fact that it was a financially undereducated population because it had been excluded, and unsophisticated population economically, financially, and they were sitting on a cache of home equity. And so they systematically peddled high cost, high risk mortgages to African Americans, even if they qualified for conventional loans, and even if they qualified for FHA lending, which would be more protected. They went in and peddled high cost, high risk loans, and in very deceptive and racially prejudicial and discriminatory ways. And as they did this, they put a growing share of the black housing stock at risk of foreclosure and repossession. And so when the housing bust happened in 2008, foreclosures hit African American neighborhoods much more heavily than white neighborhoods or Asian neighborhoods. Latino neighborhoods were also hit for similar but different reasons. They were also peddled high cost, high risk loans in a predatory fashion. So the net effect of the housing bust and the Great Recession was a massive destruction and extraction of wealth from Black communities that were already poor, but had somehow managed to acquire a bit of wealth. And now the bit of wealth that they had was pretty much wiped out. And this was all done illegally, in violation of all kinds of fair housing, fair lending laws. And the banks have been sued, and the mortgage brokers have been sued, and they've paid fines, but no one ever went to jail for systematic violation of the federal law. And the fines that they paid were a small fraction of the gains they made in the course of extracting wealth from the Black community and putting it into the pockets of basically white guys in New York City. So the mechanisms of exploitation and exclusion change over time. But in this case, they both took advantage of segregation to create efficient and workable mechanisms of exclusion and exploitation. One way to prevent Blacks from ever building wealth, and then among those who did manage to build wealth, extracting it and putting it somewhere else.
Just evil.
Yikes. Kind of related to that question, again, after the Great Recession and property values fell everywhere, we've certainly seen some suburbs and expensive neighborhoods that had previously been unaffordable became affordable. So we certainly saw at least some low-income and African-American people being able to move to, suburbs that had historically been probably close to 90% or 100% white. Do you see that? Obviously, you just mentioned the huge downside to the Great Recession, but do you see some of the integration that had happened as a result as a hopeful trend, or more of a fluke just because the money was financially possible?
Well, we're kind of all waiting on the 2020 census to see what's happened between 10 and 20. It's an important decade. And I don't think we're going to see a lot, an acceleration of integration. I don't think we're going to see much change there. And historically, levels of segregation did not decline as Black incomes rose. That in 1970, that didn't happen. In 1980, that didn't happen. In 1990, for the first time, we see a little bit of a decline, and it goes down, and you see the high-income African Americans get a little more access to housing in the United States, but it doesn't change much after 1990. It might have changed a bit between 2010 and 2020, but at the same time, other things have happened. So as the foreclosure crisis hit, and a lot of people lost their homes and prices fell, what's happened is that the financial people in Wall Street and elsewhere have used that as a lucrative method for making money. They've gone in and bought up foreclosed properties and are selling bonds backed by they've turned them into rental properties, and instead of renting from a landlord who you can talk to, you are renting from a financial firm that collects all the payments from the rent and use them to back bonds that they're selling on the market. So again, it's putting people at risk, and early evidence suggests that there's a lot of abuses going on in this system, and in some cases, this was directly taking. It was this kind of financialization of the rental market because of foreclosures was occurring in neighborhoods where Black homeownership rates were high. So in suburban St. Louis, what's the name of the town in suburban St. Louis that where the guy was killed by the police? Ferguson. In Ferguson, that was a neighborhood, a middle-class white neighborhood where middle-class Blacks were moving in. And they were targeted for predatory lending. And many got caught up in it. And then when the housing bust hit and property values fell, a lot of these properties were foreclosed and bought up by outside firms and turned into rental properties. And one of the reasons that so many African Americans were pulled over in Ferguson was because as property values fell, tax revenues fell, and they used driving while Black as a means of making up the shortfalls. And they would routinely pull over Black people and and use the fine revenue to offset the losses from property taxes. So that's the context in which
Wow.
the young man was killed. They were out searching for people to pull over to make money to offset their losses. And meanwhile, homeowners were often renting back at higher payments per month their own homes that they used to live in as owned properties. And so this is what's happening now nationwide. Financial firms are buying up properties and getting into the rental market, collecting the revenues, and using them to back financial instruments that are selling to bondholders.
Wow. Last question, just as I know we're running out of time. What are some of the solutions that you recommend, that you feel can reduce, the African-American poverty and contribute to eliminating the ghettos we've talked so much and that are so harmful? I know there's a thousand answers to that, but pick your top few, I guess.
Well, we've never really enforced any of the federal Housing or Fair Lending Acts sufficiently. When the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, the original legislation, which was sponsored by Senators Brooke and Mondale, had tough enforcement provisions that empowered the federal government to go out and find discriminators and prosecute. But that was all taken out as a compromise to get the law passed. It's called the Dirksen Compromise, introduced by Everett Dirksen of Illinois, back when Republicans used to be pro-civil rights. And so it was very weak, provided very weak enforcement. The enforcement mechanisms were boosted a bit in 1988, and I testified before Congress in support of that, and they were passed. But the enforcement mechanisms are still very weak and have never really been enforced. And second, I think in the post-war period, restrictive density zoning in suburbs has become a very important driver of segregation, not only by race, but by class, and levels of segregation by income and levels of segregation among Latinos and Blacks have been shown by work that I've done in collaboration with some of my current and former students has emerged as a major cause of racial segregation and class segregation in the United States. And so you need to overcome the legacy of density restrictive zoning. Now, in New Jersey, where Princeton University is, the state Supreme Court has declared that under the state constitution, you cannot write zoning legislation so that it precludes the construction of affordable housing in any municipality. And in fact, every municipality has an obligation to provide for its fair share of the need for affordable housing in the region. And so there's progress moving forward. Although New Jersey is still a very highly segregated state, there's been a movement towards greater integration and greater access to affordable housing. So affordable housing is part of the picture, and housing mobility programs have been shown to be very promising. So there's the famous Moving to Opportunity program, and there's Section 8 voucher programs.
Right.
There are affordable set-aside programs for developers. All of these provide affordable housing units in more advantaged and less segregated areas. And when properly administered, they've been found to provide access of poor people to very advantaged circumstances and improved educational systems without any negative consequences for the host communities. So I did a study in New Jersey where the Mount Laurel Doctrine, as it's called, was formed. So I did a study in Mount Laurel, New Jersey, of the housing development that resulted from the Mount Laurel lawsuit, which created this principle, the Mount Laurel principle, that no municipality can write zoning to exclude affordable housing. And there was a huge fight against the construction of 140 units of fully affordable housing in an affluent white municipality. It's a suburb of Philadelphia known as Mount Laurel, New Jersey. So 140 units went up, and 90% Black or Latino, all poor to moderate income. And we did an evaluation, and we found that contrary to what everybody predicted, when the units opened up and these people moved in, there was no increase in crime rates, there was no increase in property taxes, and there was no decrease in property values.
That's awesome.
And in fact, when we we surveyed 2 adjacent neighborhoods. We found out a third of the people in these neighborhoods next door didn't even realize there was affordable housing nearby. And when we surveyed the people that moved into this housing development and compared them with people who had got on the list and applied but had not yet gotten into any affordable housing in the development, we found that there was a massive increase in employment, in earnings, decrease in welfare dependency, increase in mental health, increase in well-being overall. And of course, the children of these households got access to much, much better, in fact, one of the better school systems in the state of New Jersey after moving out of some of the worst places like Camden and Trenton.
Is that going to be in your new book?
That's already a book. That's called Climbing Mount Laurel.
Okay.
That book came out about 4 or 5 years ago, and it won a book award. And it tells the story of how to do affordable housing developments in a successful way. And more recent work studying the long-term effects of the moving to opportunity programs, which are where people that were living in public housing in central cities were offered housing vouchers to move into integrated low-poverty areas, showed that these are having very pronounced effects, especially in the generation of the children who end up finishing high school, going on to college, getting higher paying jobs. And really moving to a good neighborhood puts them on the first rungs of a ladder of upward mobility. And it's very cost effective. And if it's done correctly, it doesn't have any negative consequences for anyone. In fact, it's a benefit for everyone. So in the state of New Jersey, it was a benefit 3 ways, because the local taxpayers didn't pay any extra cost. New Jersey taxpayers actually got a benefit because people went off welfare and on into employment.
That's great.
And the people themselves that got to move in, they moved upward in the world, and their children had a much more advantaged education. So everybody benefited in the end. And if these could be implemented more widely, I think it would go a long way towards desegregating the United States, not only on the basis of race, but also on the basis of class. And that's moving forward in New Jersey. I'm currently working with a group, Fair Housing Group in Connecticut, that is trying to set up, trying to file a lawsuit to create a similar kind of doctrine in the state of Connecticut. And certain places around the country have also followed suit. So Montgomery County, Maryland, has a rule for new developments that a certain percentage of the units have to be affordable if the developers want to build.
Yeah, so does Detroit, if you want to receive any tax incentives or anything.
Yeah, and these things have an effect. Now in Detroit, the problem is that if it's really going to be effective, it can't just be in Detroit. It needs to be more metropolitan-wide in the suburbs. And that's why density zoning in suburbs, breaking that barrier down, is so important.
And there's, that's been a national planning discussion for the last, certainly several years, but it's been gaining speed. And as you've seen, several states have actually prohibited, have either prohibited single family zoning or required that there be an option to do accessory dwelling units. As Detroit's working on its zoning ordinance, that's something that, I know we're exploring right now. I don't know if it'll be citywide, but certainly allowing, breaking down at least a lot of the, increasing the density in a lot of the neighborhoods in Detroit to open up more housing options and likely more affordable options too, because a lot of the accessory dwelling units are smaller and would be more affordable, and allow the people who own the property to likely get some extra income, which might allow them to help keep their home and fix their home up as another bonus also.
Yeah, I think these programs are very important, and we do see movement around the country, and maybe in a future presidential administration headed by a Democrat, these things might go forward more forcefully. The book Climbing Mount Laurel is used as evidence backing up these assertions in a lot of different cases around the country. And I can plug the book shamelessly because although I'm a co-author, me and my co-authors assigned all the royalties to Fair Share Housing Incorporated, which develops affordable housing in New Jersey.
We'll have to have you on maybe another day to discuss that. So I love the solutions. I think it's good for us to understand the history, but I think we can't actually start moving forward until we do get that history down. Once we get that down, I think we need to have some solutions, and I think you definitely have showed that with the Mount Laurel opportunity that you noted. Well, definitely thanks so much. Do you have something you wanted to say? I'm sorry.
Well, I think that it's important to understand the history of racism in the United States. Most Americans, black and white, don't really especially whites, don't realize the degree to which it was built into federal, state, and local policies from top to bottom. And it wasn't just, oh, there's some prejudiced individuals out there that discriminate. It was thoroughly institutionalized throughout American life. And I teach a course every year at Princeton University in the policy school, the former Woodrow Wilson School.
I was going to say that. I left that out. Yeah.
Called Race and Public Policy, which discusses how race was made through public policy in the United States from colonial times to the present.
Wow. Well, again, thanks so much for your time.
Sure.
I hope that everyone enjoyed this episode. If you enjoyed it, definitely click like and subscribe. Check out Douglas's book, American Apartheid, and also his book, Climbing Mount Laurel. I definitely will be checking that out. And let's see what we can do in our lives to make positive change. You had something you want to say? I'm sorry?
Yes, this fall, I'm going to be teaching that course, but it'll be online, virtual, with the COVID. And I'll probably send a link to this program with my presentation from my students so they can hear about the history of housing segregation.
I would love that. Yes, when that gets going, definitely shoot that to me. I'll include that in the show notes.
Sure.
Thanks so much, everyone, for your time.
Thank you.